Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. The federal government of Nigeria plans to raise the value-added tax to 7% from the current rate of 5% by the year 2020. Coming at a time that the economy is yet to kick on, with the president's economic team for his second term still shrouded in uncertainty, this announcement has been received with a lot of concern on the economic front. But what constitutes a greater source of concern is the continuing hemorrhage of revenue from the illegal mining of gold and other mineral resources in the northern parts of the country. We are now being joined by Babatunde Fowler, the Executive Chairman of the Federal Inland Revenue Service. He's here to talk to us about taxation in Nigeria, payment of royalties, plans to raise the value-added tax, and related matters. Mr. Fowler, welcome to the morning show.
Good morning, and thank you very much.
Good morning. Good to see you on the morning show. Well, let me start with an event that you just had, which was reported in the papers today, the inauguration of the Joint Tax Board Identification Number Registration System. Is this the same thing as the TIN? And if it is, what proportion of the Nigerian population or of the tax-paying public has been covered, has been issued with the TIN?
Well, basically, it's the same thing as the TIN. However, now we have what we call a consolidated tax database. That means that all taxpayers within the country and corporate organizations have their tax information residing in one database. Now, prior to this, in line with the Constitution, every state has the right to have a tax ID number for its residents, and so they used to operate in silos. So if you had a transaction, for example, in Lagos, and you reside in Kano, the Kano Internal Revenue Service will issue you a tax clearance certificate, which you bring to Lagos. Lagos will now manually confirm that that certificate is genuine and also assess the tax based on the transaction you want to carry out in Lagos. And at times, this takes a while. Secondly, if they believe your taxes paid in Kano were not sufficient, they'll ask you to pay additional tax. But now, at the touch of a button, your tax history can be seen by the tax official in Lagos, and you can carry out your business seamlessly. Or if you wanted to do a government contract, and part of the requirements is that you show evidence of a tax clearance certificate, at the touch of a button, that official will see your tax status, and you can continue on with your business. This system also keeps accurate records of all payments to government. So if you want to check your payments, let's say 3, 4, 5 years ago, you'll be able to access your system and your tax information and exactly have adequate records of all your transactions. So it makes business much easier. It also improves accountability and transparency. And you can do all these things online, 24/7, anywhere in the world.
Okay, so now will citizens, people, companies, and individuals be mandated to change to this new TIN, or is that going to be an automatic process that moves people's TINs over to this new system?
Well, it has already been done. So if you had a tax identification number in Lagos, for example, that number has been mirrored. So it's in this combined tax database. The taxpayer doesn't have to do anything at all. All that has already been done. The taxpayer just has to continue operating as normal. And for new taxpayers, all they have to do, they can apply online, go to the JTB net web, and complete the process.
Well, it's good to hear that, a lot is being done about data, because data is so central to tax administration. But in your view, what is responsible? What are the factors really responsible for low tax compliance in Nigeria? It's like many Nigerians don't want to pay tax.
Well, if I can just go back in history a little bit. In the early 70s, when Nigeria started to export oil in commercial quantities, and people realized that the revenue generated from oil was sufficient to carry out or to cover respective budgets, both at the federal and state level, people forgot about taxes. And for the next 30, 40 years, we all relied on oil. And we've now came to the realization that the only way to ensure sustainable economic and social development is through tax revenue. And so now you had a whole generation, and if you consider a generation to cover a period of 35 to 40 years, that were not used to paying taxes. And so that we had a very low level of compliance, partly because the government never insisted that people pay taxes. We did not require domestic tax revenue to carry on our business. I remember also, and at that same period, head of state said money wasn't a problem, but how to spend it. So there was really no need for taxation. But now it's clear that every developed country has to look inward, has to have their citizens to pay taxes to fund governments on a consistent level. And basically that's where we are now. We're reforming our tax system. We're trying to make sure that regardless of the oil price, that both the federal and state governments would have sufficient revenue to meet their mandates and provide a conducive environment for business and for living.
Well, yes, taxes are continuously dwarfed by oil earnings, and this does affect our economic diversification in a certain way. But I think another issue here, sir, would be the fact that while we're trying to do work on tax reform, we also need to look into welfare reform. As a citizen myself that has paid out of pocket for education, healthcare, even your road use, etc., for so many years, what is there to incentivize a citizen to want to pay taxes when they believe that they're paying out of pocket for the welfare that the government should be providing them? And then, to add to that as well, the government, in terms of declaring what our taxes are used on, why is there a lack of transparency when it comes to this? Because these are things that keep the average citizen kind of deterred from paying taxes.
Well, you're quite true, but in a situation where a majority of the people and corporate organizations were not paying taxes or not paying the correct amount of taxes, then of course it became difficult for them to question government. And especially when you had a situation whereby on a monthly basis, based on oil sales, there'll be a division of revenue. Nobody really paid attention. But then the question is, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? So now we find ourselves in a situation where we have to improve our infrastructure, and the oil revenue is not sufficient. And so we have to rely on taxation. And there's a lead time. When you pay your taxes this year, for example, you might not see the impact until a year. It takes a while for a road to be constructed. It takes a while for a hospital to be renovated. It takes a while for a school to be renovated. So there's a time lag, but I'm sure you can see the impact of this current government on the rail system, on the feeding program for kids. So eventually, the benefits of these tax payments will be clear to you and I. And sometimes people are a bit impatient. They'll believe that their road in front of their house is the most important thing to be fixed. They might think that the school down the street is the most important thing to be fixed. But government has to look at certain things and try and prioritize the immediate issues. And also at the state level, they also have to look at what they want to focus on first. And so eventually, as the revenue continues to improve, government will be in a position, both at the federal and state level, to provide all these services and repair all the infrastructure that needs to be repaired, and also put in place new required infrastructure.
Mr. Fowler, during the presidential campaign for the 2019 general election, at least one presidential candidate argued that one way in which Nigeria can expand its tax base is to reduce taxes. And those who agree with this view cite the example in particular of company income tax, which they say is too high, is too punitive, and that perhaps if we were to reduce taxes, we will be able to cover more people. What do you think? Do you share this view?
Well, I share the view in this particular on this particular subject that if you say you want to reduce the taxes for the small-scale businesses from maybe 30 to 20%, that is a possibility. But at the same time, in a situation where the oil revenue is dwindling and you reduce the taxes that you're currently collecting, then you'll find yourself in a situation where both the federal and state governments will not be able to meet salaries or even meet the recurrent expenditure So there has to be time, there has to be a strategic plan whereby when we get a high level of compliance and the tax revenue is sufficient or close to being sufficient, then we can consider reducing the tax rate. But in terms of the rates, we've got to realize that Nigeria currently has one of the lowest tax rates, both when it comes to individual tax, when it comes to VAT, and also when it comes to corporate tax. The countries that Nigerians love to go to for vacations, for holiday, or for so-called businesses have higher tax rates than we do. Even in Africa, if you just visit our neighbors, both in the West African sub-region or South Africa, you'll find out that their tax rates are even higher than Nigeria. So we have to actually do what is required. We have to build our infrastructure. We have to have a situation whereby the infant mortality rate is brought to the lowest. The fact that we cannot combat malaria effectively. And these are all choices that you and I have to make. And the only way we can make those choices is by contributing towards government, by paying our taxes.
And then, of course, there are also schemes that have been developed to increase the tax base that we have, such as the voluntary assets and income declaration scheme, sir. How would you rate this scheme amongst other schemes that we've seen in terms of increasing the tax base?
Well, in terms of increasing the tax base, it did play a very vital role in that it brought to the forefront the importance of paying taxes. On the individual level, we saw an increase of about maybe 8 million individuals. But in terms of the financial increase, it was minimal. But I think what we now have to consider are the consequences for those defaulters who don't come forward or who have not come forward or who do not pay the correct amount of taxes. And that is what we're looking at. We've spent the last 2-3 years trying to encourage defaulting organizations and individuals to come forward. And I think at the Joint Tax Board, we have taken a position that it's unfair for a few to pay taxes and for others to benefit from the tax payment. And so we'll use all legal means to make sure that those who have not come forward face the law and pay the appropriate taxes.
Well, Mr. Fowler, one of the objectives of the VAIDS, anyway, we'll take a short break and then we'll come back and I will complete that question, still on the VAIDS. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Still with us in our Abuja studio is the Executive Chairman of the Federal Inland Revenue Service, Mr. Babatunde Fowler, who has been having a conversation with us this morning about taxation, tax reform, and other issues. Mr. Fowler, I was talking about the voluntary assets income declaration scheme. The original objective was to grant an amnesty period to bring in defaulting individuals and companies. Now, at the end of the day, that scheme did not quite meet the target, the projected target. Another plan was to make sure that the federal government used the VIDS to increase the tax to GDP ratio from at least from 6% up. But that objective, again, was not quite met. Why do you think the scheme has not been so successful?
I think a major reason is that there are no consequences. People believe that maybe government didn't have sufficient information. People thought that even if they did pay, it might open a door to things that they've been trying to hide for a while. And I'll give you some data. Under the VAT scheme, we had about 5,000 applications at the federal level, which resulted in about 92 billion, out of which about 60 billion has been paid. But since then, after talking with various stakeholders, I'm sure you've heard of the lien on bank accounts that we have put into effect. We have recognized over 46,000 accounts that have banking turnover of over 100 million and above annually for 3 years that are still not in the tax net. Now, 1,500 of those accounts alone have already remitted 63 billion in terms of tax revenue. And that is about 2% of that 46,000 that did not come through VADs. So I think Nigerians still believe that we don't have information, but with the launch of the new TIN project, it was clearly made known to them that we do have information and that there will be consequences for those who do not pay their taxes. You've got to realize that they operate within this society, within this economy. They make their profits and their income within this society. So it's only proper that they do the right thing. And we've got to realize that you only pay tax when you generate a profit or you earn an income.
Okay, so now before we went on a break, you also mentioned that the Joint Tax Board came to a realization that there had been some level of unfairness, and that, of course, people who were not paying taxes were going to be made to face the law. Now, one thing that has happened, of course, is then the blocking of people's current accounts. And this has been done as a sort of deterrent and to find the 46,000, for example, that you just mentioned, of accounts that are not paying their taxes. But on the other end of the stick, sir, this has also served as a serious deterrent for a lot of foreign investment too that already lack a lot of hope in the government. So where is the middle ground on this matter at hand?
Well, you see, I see things a bit differently. For people who love their country, would want to support their country, the people that we're referring to as investors, whether they're from Europe or from the United States of America, would not invest their money in a country where the citizens themselves don't pay taxes. I think in those countries, the worst thing that you could do is to be a tax dodger and not pay your taxes. It certainly shows that you don't want to be part of that society, or you don't love your neighbor, or you don't love your country. So taxes has never deterred any investor. What they want to have is certainty, and that is what this government has done. In terms of the ease of doing business, when it comes to tax administration, we have moved positively by 25 places within the last two operating results, or last 2 years. And I'm sure in 2019, by the World Bank ranking, that will improve further. So it has never deterred foreign investments. What an investor wants to know is that the market that they're going into, the citizens and residents of that country also appreciate the country. And I think if you look at the increase on foreign direct investments in the last 2-3 years of this government, you'll see it has been on an increase.
Well, Mr. Fowler, you've talked about oil revenue, and I do know that oil companies in Nigeria, they pay taxes, they pay royalties, and you know, a substantial part of federal revenue comes from those taxes and royalties. But we have this situation in some states of the Federation, Zamfara, Katsina, and Bauchi, where there's a lot of illegal mining going on by companies, both owned by foreigners and also some Nigerians. Now, what is the FIRS doing to make sure that, you know, those involved in this mining, illegal mining, or maybe some of them even have mining leases, you know, prospecting for gold, uranium, and all of that, whatever. What is the FIRS doing to make sure that they are brought into the tax net and that they are made to pay taxes to Nigeria and royalties as well?
Well, let me try and answer that question. Yes, on two fronts. When it comes to the royalties and other approvals, it's actually the Ministry of Mines. And I'm quite aware that in the last dispensation, although it's still the same government continuing, they had done quite a bit in terms of registering all the miners. They've also looked at the outstanding royalties that are supposed to be paid. But when it comes to the taxes based on the profits that they generate, we also work with them. We have the list of all the approved organizations or businesses that are involved in mining, and they're supposed to file annual returns. And we'll make sure that they do pay the taxes on the profits declared. And in terms of the individuals, the state governments will also make sure that they remit their payee as when due.
Okay, so now I know you mentioned.
But you're right. There are a lot of them who are not paying what they should pay, but the government is certainly following up on that.
We must also mention, sir, that you mentioned that foreign direct investment has increased. And although we're seeing minimal increases slowly, we did also fall to our lowest in the last quarter of 2018. So there's still some shakes there. But a greater concern on behalf of the citizens here at home in Nigeria when it comes to tax payments is also that of multiple different streamlines, of course, in terms of paying tax. Is the FIRS currently doing anything to downline this and to make sure that we have less streamlines to go through? Because this is something that clearly is also a deterrence for the people.
I'm not sure if I heard you properly, but I thought you said, did you say multiple taxation?
Multiple taxation.
Yes,
That's what
sir.
she's talking about. And what is the Joint Tax Board doing, if anything, to streamline multiple taxes?
Yes, sir.
Okay, first of all, I think what we're talking about is double taxation, whereby you pay a tax to one state and you pay the same tax to another state. Now, this new system will basically remove that situation permanently. Once you have one tax ID, that tax ID is seen across the nation. So if, for example, you underpaid in your state and you have a transaction in another state, the tax official will simply look at your profile and tell you that for you to carry out this business in my state, you have to go back to your state, file your returns properly, and pay the shortfall to that state. That will eliminate it. Now, we also had situations whereby people spoke about taxes at the local government level. And we found out that some of those charges were not legal, or the amounts were not correct. And we, at the Joint Tax Board, have met with the various state chairmen, and we have publicized in the papers that if you're given a tax that does not seem accurate or does not seem reasonable by any local government, please contact any FIRS office or contact the state's chairman for verification. And once that has been done, and if they need to come in on your behalf, of course free of charge, then make sure that you're not charged any taxes that you should not be charged, or any taxes that are beyond reason.
Okay,
Hello,
sir.
Mr. Fowler, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm still with you.
Okay. Let me ask you a question about the informal sector. The informal sector accounts for about 70% of business and trade in Nigeria. Is there a database covering the informal sector? And then do you have a framework for bringing small and medium-scale enterprises into the tax net?
Yes, we do have a database for the small-scale businesses. They actually account for about 37.5 million individuals. And we do have a working relationship with various stakeholders like the Central Bank of Nigeria through NIBS. They also have BVN information for about 35 million individuals. And we also have, we're connected online with Customs and CAC. So we do have all this information. And based on our working relationship, I had mentioned yesterday that as soon as we get the balance of the BVNs from the Central Bank of Nigeria, that will increase those on our tax database from 20 million to 45 million. And we believe that by the end of this year or early in 2020, we should be able to go up to about 60 million individuals on our tax database.
Okay, so now you mentioned that when doing some research on behalf of the FIRS, that at local government level, you found out that some people were being illegally charged with certain taxes. Can we get an insight into what some of these illegal charges were or are?
Well, I mean, you'll hear of very strange things like generator tax. You'll hear of things like a radio and TV license costing 100 or 200,000. Now, all those amounts don't really exist. But in talking or investigating further and contacting some of the local government chairmen, they also denied those charges. And so you have a situation whereby some fraudulent individuals sometimes issue tax assessments to taxpayers. And when you find a taxpayer who is not in the tax net, who has been trying to dodge not paying the correct amount of taxes, they sometimes fall victim to these people. But once you're in the tax net and you're given a bill, either at the state or local government level, and it doesn't seem correct, doesn't seem reasonable, please challenge it. And certainly within a matter of 24 to 48 hours, either an FIRS office or the office of the executive chairman of the state will certainly put it straight. If the tax is correct, it will be confirmed. If the tax amount or the tax type is equally wrong, they'll also confirm that you should not pay that amount. Well,
Mr. Fowler, the Federal Inland Revenue Service, under your watch, has brought in so many tax consultants. Now, these tax consultants, what difference have they been able to make, or is it just a case of job for the boys? Well, maybe you just hold your thoughts on that question, Mr. Fowler. Maybe you hold your thoughts on that question. We'll take a short break, and then when we return, we'll take your response. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Still with us in the studio is Mr. Babatunde Fowler, the Executive Chairman of the Federal Inland Revenue Service. Mr. Fowler, you were going to talk about the engagement of tax consultants, and I'd asked whether they've been able to make any difference or whether this is a case of job for the boys.
Yes, certainly it's not a job for the boys. It's very hard work. And let me give you some data to try and make you understand our situation. In the FIRS currently, we have a total staff strength of 8,000 staff, including support staff and drivers. Now, we also have an audit team. Within that audit team, we have under 1,000 members of staff. Now, if you just look at the current situation where we have over 46,000 business accounts that are not in the tax nets, that have not filed returns, that have not paid any taxes, all of those have to be audited. Now, if we decide to even assign one staff to an audit, and you are looking at 46,000, you can imagine how long it will take for those accounts to be audited. And out of transparency, we usually don't send one staff on an audit. There have to be a minimum of 2 staff. Also, we had a situation whereby some companies had not been audited for 3, 5, or even up to 7 years. And so you have a backlog of audits. Now, when you look at the impact of those audits, in 2019 alone, we've been able to generate over close to 50 billion of unpaid taxes through this audit process. So we have to, first of all, engage consultants to join our staff, to go onto the field for 2 reasons. Number 1, to increase our manpower. Number 2, to even exchange experiences and ideas. Some of our staff still need to be trained a bit better. Equally, some consultants also may need to be trained a bit better. But 2 of them working together will finally give a better output. And then we've got to realize that also the taxpayer has the right of objection. If the data collected on the field, they dispute it, the taxpayer has a right of objection. And then thirdly, what we do pay our consultants, we pay them 1% of any additional taxes that they generate based on the data supplied to us. So if they go out on an audit mission and we do not generate any additional money, the boys don't get any commission. They don't earn anything. So it's not job for the boys, it's job for the men.
Okay, sir. Now, let's also look into the future in terms of taxation in Nigeria. Of course, the FIRS has a lot that you're looking into to try and make sure that you can get more individuals and companies to start paying their taxes, and we have less accounts to audit based on manpower. Where do you see taxation in Nigeria in the next year in terms of people paying their taxes? What is the current percentage of individuals and companies that we're at now, and where should we be in about a year's time, given all these new reforms that are going on within the FIRS?
Well, if you look at where we're coming from and where we are right now, last year we did 5.3 trillion, out of which the non-oil sector accounted for 53.6%. And that, of course, was the highest revenue generated in the history of Nigeria. And I think going forward, the country will continue to generate more revenue from the non-oil sector. And I see within the next 3 years maximum, the non-oil sector should account for at least 70 to 75% of all tax revenue in the country. At the same level, the number of taxpayers should be, like I said, in excess of 60 million. In terms of corporate organizations, we do have all registered corporate organizations within our tax nets. It's just now left for them to do the right thing, pay taxes as when due. And so with all that money at the federal and state levels, it is now left for you and I as voters to vote into office people who spend this tax money wisely to our benefits.
What exactly is the situation with VAT? Recently, former Minister of Finance, Zainab Ahmed, was quoted by the media as having said that as part of a strategic revenue growth initiative of the federal government, VAT will be increase to 7.5% by next year. And you recall that much earlier, VAT had been an issue of controversy when it was proposed that, government was likely to increase VAT, and then you came to fund the new national minimum wage. And you offered some clarification that there wasn't such a plan. What is the true situation with the collection of VAT?
Well, there's no official government position to increase VAT. However, based on my personal opinion, I think VAT should be increased, and I'll give you two reasons. Number one, the VAT in Nigeria is one of the lowest in the world. The only other country that charges VAT is Dubai in the UAE, and they recently introduced it. VAT is a consumption tax, meaning that if you don't consume, you don't make a purchase on certain items, you do not pay VAT. And I'll give you a very simple example. Basic food is not vatable. If you buy a bottle of Coca-Cola in the open market, you pay 100 naira. But if you buy that same bottle of Coca-Cola at a hotel, they'll charge you 500 naira, and they'll charge you VAT. We've got to realize that VAT is the fastest growing tax type in the world. VAT, 85% of it goes to the state governments. A lot of state governments complain they do not have sufficient revenue to pay salaries. They don't have sufficient revenue to carry out capital projects. And this is one way of them having additional revenue to carry out capital projects. So from the standpoint of a tax administrator or an economics, or in terms of economics, it is only logical that once we expand the tax net, we get a higher level of compliance, we take a view and see how much VAT is being generated in the country, and then if need be, I'm sure that maybe next year, people will reason with governments, and once they see the impact of this additional revenue, I'm sure that the increase of VAT should not be an issue. Well, Nigerians pay higher VAT when they go to Ghana or South Africa or go to Europe. They pay VAT sometimes 3 times higher than what we charge in Nigeria.
Well, Mr. Fowler, let me ask you a personal question, and I'm sure it's something you are very well aware of. There is a group in FIRS called Concerned Staff of FIRS. They've been going about, they've even, I understand, they've done a petition saying that you should not be reappointed by President Muhammadu Buhari. They accuse you of a lot of infractions. They claim that under your watch, you've not been following laid down procedures and rules of the FIRS. What exactly, is the problem with these concerned staff, as they call themselves? Because, if it is politics, then the politicization of tax administration poses a threat to all the wonderful initiatives you've been talking about.
Well, like you said, concerned staff with no names. First of all, what the articles spoke about makes no sense whatsoever. We do have relationships with the unions. I think my staff are very content and very happy. Maybe not to engage in such discussion with unknown individuals, whether it's political or not. I think the president or the presidency has the machinery to investigate any of those issues, if need be. And of course, they may have investigated all those issues. And certainly there's no truth to any of such comments. And I think the presidency and the Nigerian people will look at the reforms and look at what we've been able to achieve in the last 3 years, and they'll take appropriate decisions. So I think one shouldn't be distracted by these unknown individuals, but I can assure you that certainly I don't believe they're staff. And if they're staff, maybe they're staff that do not like the reforms that we've put in place.
Okay, sir. Now, aside from taxation, which of course is a great way for us to increase general federal revenue, as we've been speaking about, what other reform initiatives should the government be looking into for us to increase our GDP? Because as we know, we're in quite a dire economical state in Nigeria right now, give or take, and we do need to look into quite a few multiple and diverse reforms. What else should we be looking into?
Well, although I'm part of this government, and not to sound political, but I think the government is taking the right steps, especially when it comes to the economy. They're focusing on agriculture, focusing on employing more youth, trying to make sure that we have a very sound foundation to encourage business, looking at the rail system, the transportation system. So I think they're doing the right thing. They're looking at the needy by giving them free food in schools to encourage the young people to go to school. So I don't know what more that they could do that they're not doing.
Well, Mr. Fowler, I wish we could continue. I would have loved to ask you a question about whether you think it's a good idea to merge the FIRS and Customs Service, but we apparently won't have more time. So thank you very much for coming to the morning show.
Thank you,
indeed.
Mr. Fowler.